The first sob did not come from the pews. It came from the altar, not loud, not dramatic, just a short, broken sound, sharp and involuntary, like breath-catching where breath should not fail. It escaped the throat of a man who had buried hundreds of bodies in his lifetime. A man who had stood beside open graves in snow and rain. A man who had read prayers over children, soldiers, strangers with no names left to remember. He had never cried for one of them. Not once. He had learned long ago how to close something inside himself, how to finish the prayer, how to lower the body, how to walk away without looking back. But this sound, this small betraying sound, slipped past all that discipline. The priest turned away. Not in shame, not to hide tears. He turned away because fear rose in him faster than grief, because the sob did not feel like sadness. It felt like recognition, like something long buried had just shifted beneath stone and prayer, like a door that had been sealed for decades had cracked open on its own. The song had only just begun. The first notes were barely there, soft, uncertain, almost apologetic. They clung to the cold air of the cathedral, weaving through pillars blackened by centuries of candle smoke. And already something ancient was waking up inside the walls. Not a memory, not a melody, but a presence. Something that had been waiting quietly, patiently, through wars, through silence, through the long years when no one asked it to speak again. The altar candles trembled, not from wind, from the weight of what was returning. But to understand why a Christmas song could break an entire Russian cathedral, we have to go somewhere colder than winter, colder than the kind of cold that cracks skin and turns breath into smoke, colder than stone floors and unheated rooms, colder than the nights when snow piles so high it swallows sound. We have to go to a cold that does not touch the body first, a cold that settles in the chest, the kind that arrives after loss, not before it, the kind that does not scream or rage, it simply stays, and darker than grief, because grief at least has a shape. Grief comes with rituals, with funerals and prayers and people who stand beside you and say the right words, even when they don't mean them. This was darker than that. This was the darkness that comes after the prayers are finished, after the chairs are stacked, after the flowers dry up and no one calls anymore, the darkness of ordinary nights, the hours when the world keeps moving, but something inside you refuses to follow. We have to go to the hours when God feels far away, not absent, not dead, just distant. The hours when faith becomes a habit instead of a comfort, when prayers are recited out of muscle memory, not hope, when you still believe, but you no longer expect to be answered. These are the hours before dawn, the hours when clocks seem louder than they should, when ceilings feel too close, when silence presses down so hard it feels like a weight on the lungs. In those hours, people do not ask big questions. They do not ask why suffering exists. They do not ask for miracles. They ask smaller, quieter things. How do I get through tonight? How do I stand up tomorrow and pretend I am still whole? How long can a person carry loss before it starts to hollow them out? This is where the story begins. Not in a cathedral filled with light, not in a moment of beauty or revelation, but in the space where belief is thin, where hope feels impractical, where survival becomes the only prayer that still works. Because what happened in that cathedral did not begin with a song. It began with a silence that lasted years, and a man who believed God had stopped listening, even though he kept whispering anyway. His name was Elias. He was Filipino, 38 years old, and invisible. Not the kind of invisible that comes from hiding, but the kind that settles over a person slowly, after years of being passed by, spoken over, looked through. The kind of invisible you become when your name is never asked for, when your presence is only noticed if something goes wrong. By day, Elias cleaned construction dust from the floors of a half-restored cathedral in a forgotten district of the city. He swept grit from corners no one ever stood in, wiped footprints from marble that would soon belong to people who would never wonder who kept it clean, scraped wax from candle stands after services he never attended. The work was quiet, repetitive, safe. No one asked questions. No one expected anything beyond clean floors and locked doors. By night, he became the cathedral's only guard. Not because he was strong, not because he was trusted, because he was there. No uniform, no badge, no weapon. Just a heavy coat that smelled faintly of disinfectant, a flashlight with a dying battery, and silence so deep it pressed against the chest like an unseen hand. The kind of silence that does not feel empty, the kind that feels occupied. At night, the cathedral changed. The echoes grew longer. The shadows stretched in ways that made the pillars look like watching figures. Every footstep came back to him twice, once from the floor, once from memory. Elias walked slow patrols between icons and scaffolding, past saints with painted eyes that followed no one and everyone at the same time, past tarps and ladders left behind by workers who only knew the building in daylight. He never rushed. Rushing felt disrespectful. Elias had not planned to come to Russia. This was never a dream, never a goal, never a prayer, he whispered when life still made sense. He had come because his wife died. No warning, no long illness, just a morning that started ordinary and ended with a silence that never lifted. After the funeral, the house in Manila felt too loud. Every room carried her absence differently. The kitchen echoed with the ghost of plates she would never wash again. The bedroom held the shape of her body, long after it was gone. Even the walls seemed to breathe too much, like they were trying to replace the sound of her. At night, Elias lay awake, listening for a rhythm that no longer existed. He could not stay. So when a distant cousin mentioned work abroad, cold country, low pay, no questions asked, Elias said yes before fear could catch up. He did not come to escape grief. He came because he did not trust himself to survive it at home. In Russia, no one knew his story. No one offered condolences. No one expected him to smile or heal. And that felt like mercy. He told himself he would stay 1 year, just long enough for the sharpest edges to dull. He did not know yet that grief does not dull. It waits, and it remembers how to sing. He used to sing. Not on stages, not into microphones, not for applause or recognition. He sang the way people do when no one is listening. Only for her. In the kitchen, while rice simmered and the radio crackled with static. In the narrow hallway, when the power went out and the city fell into darkness. During blackouts, when candles replaced light bulbs and the world shrank to 2 people, 1 room, and a melody that filled the space between them. He sang softly then, never finishing the last line too strong, always leaving room for her voice to slip in beside his. Sometimes she harmonized. Sometimes she laughed and told him he was off-key. Sometimes she leaned against the counter, eyes closed, as if the song had become something she could rest inside. Those were the safest moments of his life. After she died, Elias stopped singing. Not all at once. At first he tried to hum, just fragments, half lines, the parts of songs that didn't hurt yet. But every melody led him back to the same place, the empty space where her voice should have been. Every song turned into a conversation with no answer. Every chorus ended too soon, like a sentence cut off mid-breath. So he stopped. He learned to swallow melodies before they reached his throat. Learned to keep his mouth busy with other things. Coffee, cigarettes, quiet. Silence became his shield. When he took the night shift at the cathedral, he welcomed it. The silence there was different, heavier, older. It did not ask questions. It did not echo with memory the way his house did. It simply existed, thick and unmoving. He told himself that silence was safer than sound, that silence could not betray him, that it could not pull the past back into the present without warning. He believed that as long as he did not sing, nothing could reach him. He was wrong, because silence does not erase what is buried. It preserves it. And in that cathedral, surrounded by stone that remembered centuries, silence was never empty. It was listening. On the first night of December, the heating failed. Not all at once, not with an alarm or a warning. The warmth simply disappeared, as if the building had exhaled and decided not to breathe back in. Breath turned to fog almost immediately. Each exhale lingered in the air, pale and fragile, before dissolving into the dark. Elias pulled his coat tighter and began to pace the aisles to stay awake. His boots echoed off stone carved by hands long dead, men who had labored here with no knowledge of his name, no idea that decades later a stranger would trace their footsteps in silence. The sound followed him everywhere. One step, then another, a rhythm he could not escape. The hours stretched. The cathedral felt larger at night, endless, like a place that swallowed time. And then, without thinking, without permission from grief or memory, he hummed, low, so low it barely qualified as sound, just enough vibration to feel in the chest. A Filipino Christmas lullaby his mother used to sing when typhoons knocked the power out and the city fell into darkness. A song meant for waiting, not the waiting that demands answers, but the waiting that trusts light to return, even when it hasn't yet. A melody about staying still while the world rearranges itself, about hope arriving late, but arriving anyway. The sound drifted forward, thin and unsure, brushing against pillars and scaffolding, slipping into corners where dust slept undisturbed. Then Elias realized what he was doing. He stopped immediately. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before. Embarrassed, he cleared his throat, as if the walls had heard him, as if the cathedral itself had leaned closer, as if something old had recognized the tune and was now listening for more. What Elias did not know was that a woman was praying behind a column near the apse, an old woman, so thin she seemed almost folded into herself, so small she could disappear entirely if the shadows decided to keep her, too weak to stand for long, too stubborn to stop coming. Every evening she arrived before the doors officially closed. Every evening she stayed longer than anyone thought she should. No one asked her name anymore, not because they were cruel, but because she had outlived the need for it. Names mattered when futures were still expected. She was past that. She prayed sitting down, slowly, deliberately, each movement measured, like she was counting how many she had left. When the melody reached her, her hand froze in mid-cross, not at the forehead, not at the shoulder. Midway. As if time itself had stumbled, her breath caught, the words of her prayer vanished. Because she had not heard that tune since she was 6 years old, not since a winter when the world taught her how fragile promises were. A winter when bombs fell so often the sound stopped being frightening and became ordinary. A winter when adults smiled too much and said things like soon and tomorrow, and everything will be fine with voices that betrayed them. She remembered the cellar, the damp stone walls, the smell of earth and fear. Children packed together so tightly they shared body heat without knowing why. She remembered a woman humming, softly, always softly, not to comfort the children, but to keep herself from breaking apart. The same melody, the same pauses, the same quiet insistence that light existed somewhere beyond the walls. The old woman's fingers trembled. Her eyes filled before she understood why. Because some songs do not fade with age. They wait. And after decades of silence, this one had just found its way back to her. The woman did not cry. Not yet. Her body reacted before her heart did. She sat down, hard, the sound of bone against wood sharp in the quiet. For a moment she could not breathe, because the song was wrong, not wrong in the way mistakes are wrong, not out of tune, not misplaced, wrong in the way impossibilities are wrong. That melody was not supposed to exist. It had been buried with the children who sang it in basements during the war, children whose names were never written on headstones, whose voices faded before they ever learned what peace sounded like. It was a song passed mouth to mouth, breath to breath, too fragile for paper, too sacred for ink. It was never written down, never recorded. When the bombing stopped and the survivors scattered, the song scattered with them. And when the last of them died, the melody was supposed to die too. The choir had searched for it for decades. Archivists combed through burned hymnals. Scholars argued over fragments and rumors. Elders were interviewed until memory failed them mid-sentence. Nothing, just gaps, just silence where music should have been. The song became a story people told each other quietly, a myth, a beautiful lie. And now it was humming out of the chest of a foreign man sweeping dust from holy ground, not performing, not remembering, just breathing, as if the melody had been waiting inside him all along, as if the cathedral itself had drawn it out of him. Stone coaxing sound, silence demanding answer. The woman pressed her palm against her chest, not to steady her heart, but to confirm it was still real. Because if that song had returned, then something else, something buried just as deep, might be trying to return with it. Sing that again. The voice came from the dark, not loud, not demanding, but firm in a way that carried weight Elias could not place. He nearly dropped his flashlight. The beam jerked wildly, scattering light across pillars and scaffolding before settling on nothing at all. For a moment he thought the cathedral had spoken. Then the woman stepped forward, slowly, carefully, like someone approaching a grave they were not ready to face. Her shoes barely made a sound against the stone, but Elias felt each step anyway, felt the distance between them shrinking, felt the silence tightening around his chest. I said, her voice trembled now, thinner than before, "Sing it again." Elias shook his head immediately. "No, I'm sorry, I shouldn't." The words came out too fast, tripping over each other. Apologies he had practiced for years, ready at the first sign of being noticed. He looked away, suddenly ashamed. Ashamed of the sound. Ashamed of being heard. Ashamed of the way the song had slipped out of him without permission. But the woman did not move back. Her eyes filled, not with tears yet, but with something heavier. Fear. Not fear of him. Fear of loss. "Please," she whispered. The word barely survived the air between them. Her hands clenched at her coat, knuckles white, as if she were holding something fragile inside herself. "Please," she said again, softer now. "Before I forget it again." The sentence broke at the end, not because she was crying, because she was telling the truth. Elias felt something shift inside his chest. He understood, suddenly, that this was not about music, not about permission, not about rules or boundaries or night shift protocol. This was about memory, about something slipping away for the last time. The woman stood there, waiting, not impatient, not desperate, just afraid that if the silence returned, it would take the song with it forever. This time Elias sang, not loudly, not to fill the space, not to impress anyone standing in the shadows. He sang the way he used to when the power went out and fear crept in quietly. as if raising his voice might break something fragile. Not beautifully. His voice cracked on the first note. The cold caught in his throat. The years of silence resisted him. But honestly, every sound carried weight. Every pause meant something. The second verse trembled, not because he forgot the words, but because he remembered them too well. And something moved through the cathedral. Not sound. Memory. It travelled faster than echo, slipped past stone and scaffolding, reached places no renovation ever touched. A choir member arriving early stopped walking mid-step, fingers still wrapped around a coat button. The melody snagged on something inside her chest, something she hadn't named since childhood. A priest preparing candles closed his eyes. The flame wavered in his hand as a face rose uninvited from the past. A voice he hadn't heard since before faith became duty. A soldier assigned to security lowered his head, one hand tightening around the strap of his rifle. For a moment, he was not guarding anything. He was just standing still, listening to a memory he didn't know he had permission to feel. No one spoke, no one moved. The song passed through them without asking. It did not explain itself. It did not demand understanding. It simply arrived. And where sermons tried to teach, where words tried to persuade, where doctrine tried to hold, the song reached places sermons never touched, the places people sealed off to survive, the places they promised themselves they would never open again. And one by one, those places began to open anyway. By the time Elias finished, no one spoke. The last note did not echo. It did not linger. It simply disappeared, as if it had gone where it was meant to go and no further. No one clapped. No one moved to break the moment, because applause would have been a lie. This was not a performance. There was nothing to celebrate. They wept, openly, without embarrassment, without restraint. Tears slid down faces that had learned to stay composed in public. Men who had trained themselves never to show weakness wiped their eyes with the backs of their hands and did not apologize for it. Women who had survived long enough to forget what crying felt like shook where they stood. Not because the song was sad. It wasn't. There were no tragic lyrics, no mention of death, no story of loss spelled out in words. They cried because the song reminded them of something they had survived, and something they had never forgiven themselves for surviving. Faces returned to them. Siblings who didn't make it out of cellars. Friends whose names were spoken once too often, and then never again. Children who had sung beside them and gone silent before spring arrived. The guilt rose quietly, the way it always does. Why them? Why not me? The kind of questions that never leave, only soften with time until they can be carried. The priest was the first to move. Slowly, as if his body were older than it had been moments before, he stepped away from the altar. He knelt, not in prayer, not to ask forgiveness, not to offer thanks. He knelt because his legs gave out, because authority and ritual and training had nothing left to stand on. It was not reverence that bent him. It was surrender. Surrender to the truth that faith does not always come from Scripture, that healing does not always arrive through sermons, that sometimes God reaches people through the one thing they thought they had buried forever. A song, sung by a man who did not know what he was carrying, returned to a place that had been waiting, patiently, for decades to hear it again. Later, in the sacristy, they showed Elias an old box. It was smaller than he expected, unremarkable, the kind of box that could be mistaken for storage and forgotten in a corner for decades. The priest opened it slowly, as if the hinges might protest. Inside lay fragments of time, burnt paper, edges curled and blackened, the ink long faded into ghosts of words, half-melted wax, hardened into misshapen tears that had once dripped from candles lit in fear rather than faith. And a child's drawing, crude, uneven, of stars scattered above a cellar door. Not the sky, just stars, as if the child believed heaven might still find them underground. Elias felt his chest tighten. The priest lifted one final sheet. On the back, a melody line, incomplete, broken off mid-phrase, as though whoever wrote it had been interrupted. The same melody, not similar, not inspired by, the same. This was sung by children hiding during the war, the priest said quietly. His voice did not carry authority now, only care. We lost it when the last of them died. Elias stared at the page. He did not touch it. He was afraid that if he did, the connection might shatter. My mother sang this, he said at last, his voice barely above breath. She sang it when the power went out, when storms came. He swallowed. She said she learned it from a woman who washed ashore in our village. A pause. Who never spoke of where she came from. No one spoke. The room felt suddenly too small for the weight of what had just been said. Centuries of distance collapsed into a single moment. Wars, oceans, silences, all folded inward. Someone crossed themselves without realizing it. Someone else closed their eyes. Because suddenly the world felt smaller, not safer, but more connected. As if suffering had left fingerprints across borders, across generations, and love had followed, quietly, refusing to be erased. And in that narrow room, surrounded by ash and wax and a child's fragile hope, God felt closer. Not because he had spoken, but because something lost had found its way home. That night, the cathedral bells rang longer than scheduled. Not by mistake, not because anyone forgot to stop them. They rang because no one could bring themselves to interrupt what had already begun. The sound rolled out over the streets, slow, heavy, unhurried, spilling into alleyways and empty squares, climbing apartment walls, slipping through cracked windows where people sat awake without knowing why. Not for celebration. There was no joy in it, no triumph. This was not the sound of victory. It was the sound of recognition, of something long dismissed finally being acknowledged, of a wound no longer pretending it wasn't there. Elias stood alone near the doors when the bells began. He did not look up. He did not smile. He simply listened, hands folded loosely in front of him, as if the sound required stillness. By morning, nothing had changed. No reporters came. No invitations followed. No one asked him to sing again in front of crowds. Elias did not become famous. His name did not spread beyond the walls that already knew his footsteps. He did not join the choir, did not stand beneath lights, did not step forward into a life that demanded more from him than he could give. He returned to sweeping floors, to wiping dust from stone, to moving quietly through spaces that were never meant to notice him. But something had shifted. When night came again, and the silence settled the way it always had, Elias did not fight it. He sang. Softly, carefully, not to summon memory, not to test whether anyone was listening. He sang because the song no longer hurt the way it used to. Not for the dead. They had already carried it long enough. For the living. For the ones still awake in the dark. For the ones who survived and never learned how to forgive themselves for it. For the ones who believed they were alone in their remembering. Because some songs do not belong to nations, they do not belong to languages or borders or history books, they belong to wounds, and when they are finally sung, aloud, when they are no longer hidden or whispered or swallowed, even stone learns how to cry.